The disturbing reality
Hey
of medieval
guys,
child
tonight,
marriages.
let's dim
Hey
the
guys,
lights.
tonight, let's dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket up over your shoulders and drift slowly into a world that, for lack of a better phrase, was, well, completely different from ours. A world where childhood wasn't really what we think of today.
A
Where the
world
notion
where
of growing up was
childhood
occasionally
wasn't
rushed
really
along by
what we
political
think of
ambitions,
today,
dynastic
where the
planning,
notion
and,
of
because
growing
why
up
not,
was
the occasional
occasionally
sense of
rushed
family
along
duty.
by political
We're talking about
ambitions,
medieval child
dynastic
marriages.
planning, and
Yes,
because
the kind
why
of unions
not,
that make
the
modern adults
occasional
uncomfortable,
sense of
mostly because
family
they involved
duty.
actual children,
We're talking
sometimes barely
about
old enough to
medieval
understand what
child
marriage meant,
marriages.
or at least what it was
Yes, the
supposed to
kind of
entail in the
unions that
legal,
make
social,
modern
and political
adults
sense.
uncomfortable, mostly
So,
because
settle in,
they
take a
involved
slow breath,
actual
and
children,
let's float through this quiet history.
sometimes barely old
Not too
enough
much
to
excitement here.
understand what
Just a
marriage
gentle,
meant,
almost
or at
hypnotic
least
tour of the
what it
lives of
was
children
supposed
thrust
to
into royal or
entail
noble
in the
unions that were
legal,
meant to secure
social,
power,
and
property,
political
or
sense.
alliances.
So,
And if you
settle
find yourself
in,
twitching a
take
little
a
at some
slow
of the
breath,
details,
and
that's
let's
normal.
float through this
But remember,
quiet
we're just
history.
drifting, like a
Not
lazy
too
boat down a
much
mildly
excitement
unsettling
here,
river.
just a
Let's begin
gentle,
somewhere
almost
reasonably boring.
hypnotic tour of
I
the
mean,
lives of
fittingly
children
historical.
thrust into
Say,
royal or
12th
noble
century Europe.
unions that were meant
Because
to
Europe had a
secure
long
power,
tradition of formal agreements
property,
between
or
families, which
alliances.
sometimes meant
And
promising a
if you
3-year-old
find
girl to a
yourself
10-year-old
twitching a
boy.
little at some of the
Naturally, these
details,
agreements were
that's
drawn up by
normal.
adults,
But
who,
remember, we're
unsurprisingly, were
just
mostly men,
drifting,
who thought
like
that
a
childhood
lazy
was a
boat
flexible
down
concept.
a mildly
Oh, she's
unsettling
barely
river.
10. Perfect.
Let's begin somewhere
That's plenty old
reasonably
enough to be
boring.
betrothed, said
I
no
mean,
modern person ever,
fittingly
but very much the
historical.
consensus back
Say,
then.
12th
Of
century
course,
Europe,
the ceremony might have
because
been
Europe
symbolic
had a
at
long
first.
tradition of formal
Nobody expected the
agreements
kids to
between
live together as
families,
spouses
which
immediately.
sometimes meant
That would
promising
have
a
been
3-year-old
uncomfortable,
girl
to say the
to a
least.
10-year-old boy.
So families often waited
Naturally,
until
these
puberty, though
agreements
in
were
some
drawn up
cases,
by
puberty was
adults
basically a
who,
suggestion.
unsurprisingly,
And puberty
were
wasn't
mostly men
necessarily
who
a guarantee
thought
that the marriage would
childhood
suddenly be
was a
normal.
flexible concept.
Sometimes it was just a
Oh,
formal
she's barely
excuse to
10.
proceed, while parents,
Perfect.
relatives,
That's
and
plenty
advisors
old
oversaw
enough to
everything
be
like mildly
betrothed,
anxious stage
said no
directors.
modern person
Take
ever,
Eleanor of
but
Aquitaine,
very
for
much
instance.
the consensus back
She was
then.
married to Louis VII
Of
of
course,
France at the
the
tender age
ceremony
of
might have
15.
been symbolic at
15
first.
is, by our standards, a
Nobody
teenager barely
expected
allowed
the
to vote in
kids
some
to
modern
live together
countries,
as
but in the 12th
spouses
century,
immediately.
she was expected to manage
That
a
would have
household,
been
provide heirs,
uncomfortable,
and
to
somehow
say the
navigate the
least.
labyrinth of French court
So
politics.
families often
She
waited until
reportedly had a sharp
puberty,
mind, which
though in
probably
some
made things
cases,
slightly easier.
puberty was
But the
basically
marriage
a
itself was,
suggestion.
in some
And
ways, a
puberty
practical
wasn't
arrangement more than an
necessarily a
emotional connection.
guarantee that the
Louis
marriage
VII
would
was,
suddenly
well,
be
Louis
normal.
VII,
Sometimes
pious,
it was
serious,
just
and
a
possibly
formal
the least
excuse
emotionally
to
equipped husband
proceed,
for a
while
teenage girl with growing
parents,
ambitions.
relatives, and
They produced
advisors
2 daughters,
oversaw
which was a bit
everything
of a
like
problem, because
mildly
producing sons
anxious
was kind of the
stage
main goal.
directors.
Eventually,
Take
they were
Eleanor
annulled,
of
though not
Aquitaine,
before
for
Eleanor had gotten a
instance.
taste of both
She
royal
was married
life and the
to Louis
confusing reality
VII
of
of
being a teenage
France
queen.
at the tender age
Now,
of 15.
Eleanor was relatively lucky in the sense that she
15
survived
is,
childhood,
by our
puberty,
standards,
and the
a
marriage without
teenager
dying from
barely
complications,
allowed to
a common
vote
outcome
in
in this
some
era.
modern countries.
Many child
But
brides,
in the 12th century,
especially
she
in
was
rural noble
expected to
families,
manage a
weren't so
household,
fortunate.
provide
There were
heirs,
infections,
and somehow
childbirth
navigate
complications,
the
and the
labyrinth
relentless
of
physical
French
toll of
court
early
politics.
pregnancies.
She
In fact,
reportedly
a
had a
14-year-old
sharp
girl
mind,
married to a
which
man in his
probably
20s or
made
30s
things
might already
slightly
be experiencing
easier.
physical trauma that
But
would
the
shape the rest
marriage
of her life.
itself was, in
And yet,
some ways,
this was
a
considered normal.
practical arrangement
Normal,
more
of
than
course,
an
in the
emotional
quiet,
connection.
dusty, stone-cold
Louis
logic of medieval
VII
dynasties.
was, well,
Let's
Louis
drift over
VII
to England in the
pious,
13th century.
serious, and
Here,
possibly the
arranged
least
child marriages were
emotionally
rampant among
equipped
nobility.
husband for a
Families
teenage girl
carefully
with
calculated
growing
alliances,
ambitions.
dowries, and property
They
transfers,
produced
often
2
sacrificing
daughters,
what we would
which was a
consider
bit
common
of a
sense or,
problem,
frankly,
because
basic
producing
childhood
sons
well-being.
was kind of
A
the
girl
main
might be
goal.
promised to a boy she had never met,
Eventually, they were
sometimes with a
annulled,
decade or
though
more
not
separating their
before
ages.
Eleanor had gotten a
And because
taste of
politics
both
was
royal
slow and
life
deliberate,
and the
sometimes the
confusing
ceremonial
reality
marriage would
of
happen when
being
one
a
child was
teenage
5 or
queen.
6 and the other
Now,
perhaps 8 or
Eleanor
9.
was relatively
The formal
lucky in the
consummation would
sense
wait,
that she
but puberty
survived
was coming,
childhood,
eventually.
puberty,
One
and
the marriage without dying from complications a common outcome in this era. Many child brides, especially in rural noble families, weren't so fortunate.
But for now,
there were
he was
infections,
just a slightly older man marrying a child for the usual reasons,
and the relentless
alliances,
physical
territory,
toll of
and a
early
mild indifference to her
pregnancies.
personal
In
comfort.
fact,
Isabella was
a
expected
14-year-old
to
girl
mature
married
fast,
to a man in
produce
his
heirs,
20s
and
or
navigate the treacherous
30s
waters
might
of a court that
already be
was,
experiencing
predictably, full of
physical
plotting
trauma
relatives
that
and
would
minor
shape
lords
the
ready to
rest
take
of her
offense.
life. And
And,
yet,
as it turned
this
out,
was
she
considered
survived,
normal.
and eventually her marriage
Normal,
produced children
of
who would
course,
continue the
in the
lineage, as
quiet,
intended.
dusty,
But the pressure and
stone-cold
danger
logic
at such
of
a young
medieval
age were immense.
dynasties. Let's
Across the
drift
Channel,
over to
in the Holy
England
Roman
in the
Empire,
13th
things were equally
century.
peculiar,
Here,
if slightly less
arranged
documented.
child marriages were
Here,
rampant
families
among
sometimes betrothed
nobility.
children in infancy.
Families carefully
Yes,
calculated
infants.
alliances,
Because nothing
dowries,
says
and
long-term planning
property
quite like
transfers,
promising your newborn
often
daughter to a distant
sacrificing
cousin she
what
has
we
never
would
met.
consider common
These
sense
agreements were
or,
legal contracts.
frankly, basic
They involved
childhood well-being.
negotiations over land,
A
titles,
girl
and
might be
future
promised
political
to a boy
alliances.
she had never met,
And in a lot of
sometimes
cases,
with a
these child
decade or
marriages
more
weren't intended for
separating their
immediate domestic
ages.
life.
And because
Sometimes they
politics
were
was
symbolic
slow
gestures,
and
sealed with
deliberate,
tokens like rings or
sometimes the
ceremonial
ceremonial
ceremonies that made
marriage would
everything
happen
official.
when one
The
child
kids were
was
essentially
5 or
pawns,
6,
with the adults
and
controlling
the
the game
other
board.
perhaps 8 or
And
9.
what about the kids
The
themselves?
formal consummation
Well,
would
records
wait,
aren't terribly
but
detailed,
puberty
because
was
children's
coming.
experiences were rarely
Eventually.
considered historically
One
significant unless
famous
something dramatic
example
happened.
is Isabella of
But we do know that
Angoulême,
many child
married
brides
at
and grooms
12
grew up
to
in
King
environments
John of
heavy with
England,
expectation.
who was in his
Lessons
late
in etiquette,
20s.
religion, and
King
household
John,
management
of
started
course,
early.
is the famously
Some were
unpleasant
trained in
monarch
diplomacy,
behind
some in
the
reading
Magna
Latin
Carta
texts,
debacle.
and some simply in the art of being
But
quiet
for
and
now,
obedient until
he
their
was
parents
just a
decided it was
slightly
time to
older
become actual
man
spouses.
marrying a child for
It's
the
hard to
usual
imagine this as a
reasons:
childhood by modern standards,
alliances,
more like a slow
territory,
induction into a
and
life
a
of
mild
adult responsibility
indifference
before
to her
one fully
personal
understood what it meant to
comfort.
be alive.
Isabella
By
was
the 14th and
expected to
15th
mature
centuries,
fast,
this pattern continued
produce
and even
heirs,
intensified
and
among the
navigate
highest
the
nobility.
treacherous waters
Families
of a
sought
court
strategic
that was
alliances across
predictably
regions,
full of
kingdoms, and
plotting
sometimes
relatives
continents.
and minor lords,
Girls as
ready
young
to
as 7
take
were betrothed to
offense.
boys almost
And,
twice their
as
age.
it turned out, she
These
survived, and
unions were
eventually her
accompanied by
marriage
vast dowries,
produced
legal
children who
contracts,
would
and
continue the
occasionally
lineage
ceremonial
as
feasts that were more
intended.
about impressing foreign
But the
dignitaries than
pressure
celebrating the
and
children
danger
involved.
at such a young
And for
age
many,
were
the eventual
immense.
consummation of the marriage
Across
wasn't
the
a private
Channel,
family
in the
matter.
Holy
It was
Roman
observed,
Empire,
monitored, and recorded
things
by
were
court
equally
officials.
peculiar, if
Because,
slightly
of course,
less
history loves to
documented.
preserve the awkward
Here,
details that future
families
generations can
sometimes
quietly
betrothed
analyze while half
children in
asleep.
infancy.
A particularly
Yes,
telling example
infants.
comes from Portugal,
Because
where
nothing
royal girls
says
were routinely
long-term
married in their early
planning
teens
quite
to
like
older men from
promising your
Spain or France
newborn
to secure
daughter to
political
a
stability.
distant cousin she
One
has
might
never
imagine
met.
a 13-year-old girl
These
sitting
agreements
quietly in
were
a castle
legal
hall
contracts.
while an adult man waits
They
patiently
involved
or impatiently
negotiations
on the
over
other side of a
land,
ceremonial
titles,
threshold.
and future
The room is
political
decorated with
alliances.
banners, tapestries,
And in a
maybe
lot
a
of
slightly
cases,
overcooked
these
goose.
child marriages
The girl,
weren't
with little
intended for
understanding of the
immediate
political calculus
domestic
behind the
life.
arrangement, is expected to smile,
Sometimes
nod
they were
politely, and
symbolic
eventually learn her
gestures,
duties.
sealed with
Meanwhile,
tokens
the
like
adults around her
rings or
discuss matters of
ceremonial
land,
ceremonies
power, and
that
succession as
made
though nothing
everything
unusual
official.
is happening at all.
The kids were
It's simultaneously
essentially
fascinating
pawns,
and quietly
with the
tragic.
adults controlling
And
the
of
game
course,
board.
there were cultural
And
variations.
what about the kids
In Italy,
themselves?
child marriages among
Well,
the noble families
records
often
aren't
involved
terribly
intense education,
detailed,
including
because
music,
children's
literature, and religious
experiences
instruction,
were rarely
preparing girls for
considered
lives as
historically
queens or duchesses.
significant
In
unless
France,
something
girls
dramatic
sometimes married
happened.
royal cousins,
But we
and the
do
courts
know
kept
that
meticulous
many
records of
child
births,
brides
deaths,
and grooms
marriages,
grew up
almost
in
obsessively
environments
tracking
heavy
bloodlines
with
to ensure nothing
expectation.
embarrassing happened in the gene
Lessons
pool.
in etiquette,
And it
religion,
did, of
and
course,
household
because medieval
management
inbreeding was a
started
long-running,
early.
somewhat horrifying
Some were
hobby among
trained in
European
diplomacy,
elites.
some
But
in
we'll get to
reading
that
Latin
later.
texts, and
For now,
some
let's
simply
gently
in the
observe
art
one
of
more
being
example from the
quiet
distant
and
reaches of Europe.
obedient until their
In
parents
Castile, a
decided
young
it
princess
was
was
time
married
to
at 11 to
become
a prince
actual
slightly older than her.
spouses.
They grew up together, slowly learning the strange rhythms of royal life.
By modern standards,
Lessons in governance,
more
etiquette,
like a
and religious
slow
piety filled their
induction
days.
into a life of
They were
adult
expected to provide
responsibility
heirs, secure
before one
alliances,
fully
and maintain
understood what it
appearances,
meant to
all
be
while
alive.
negotiating the tiny
By the
dramas of
14th
adolescence.
and 15th centuries,
And of course,
this
the
pattern
entire arrangement was
continued
considered
and
utterly
even
normal by everyone
intensified
involved.
among the highest
So,
nobility.
as we flowed along this
Families
quiet,
sought
medieval river,
strategic
we can see a few
alliances
things.
across regions,
1.
kingdoms,
Childhood in
and
the royal and
sometimes
noble
continents.
classes was not really a time of play,
Girls as young as
exploration, or
7
freedom.
were betrothed to
2.
boys
Marriages were
almost
tools,
twice their
meticulously
age.
arranged and monitored
These
for political
unions
benefit.
were accompanied by
3.
vast dowries,
The children themselves,
legal
while surviving
contracts,
into adulthood in
and
some cases,
occasionally
were often stressed,
ceremonial
overworked,
feasts
and
that were
placed
more
under enormous
about
expectations
impressing
long
foreign
before they were ready.
dignitaries than
Let's
celebrating
pause for
the
a
children
breath.
involved.
You might be
And
feeling
for
a little
many,
tired
the
already.
eventual
Good.
consummation of
That's
the
exactly
marriage
the point.
wasn't a private
We're drifting
family
through
matter,
dusty halls,
was
quiet
observed,
castles,
monitored,
and faintly
and
overheated chambers
recorded
where
by
children were
court
expected to be
officials.
kings,
Because,
queens,
of
or pawns of
course,
dynastic
history
ambition.
loves to preserve
It's
the awkward
monotonous,
details
it's slightly
that
uncomfortable,
future
and it's historically
generations can
accurate.
quietly
Perfect
analyze
for bedtime.
while half asleep.
And soon, we'll
A
drift further into the
particularly
world of
telling
these young
example
royals,
comes
exploring
from
not just
Portugal,
marriages,
where
but the
royal
children who bore
girls
the weight
were
of
routinely
expectations, the
married in
surprising
their early
variety of their daily
teens to
lives,
older
and the
men
ways in
from
which even the
Spain or
most carefully
France
arranged
to
alliances
secure
sometimes went
political
completely
stability.
sideways.
One might imagine a
But for now,
13-year-old
let's let the
girl
gentle hum of
sitting
history carry
quietly
us,
in a castle
slowly,
hall,
deeper into the
while
world of
an
medieval
adult
child
man
marriages,
waits
growing up
patiently
too
or
fast, daily
impatiently
lives
on
of
the other
child brides
side
and
of a
grooms.
ceremonial threshold.
So, as we
The
continue
room
drifting
is
along this quiet
decorated with
medieval river,
banners,
let's take a closer
tapestries,
look at what
and
life was actually
maybe a
like for these
slightly
children once their
overcooked
marriages were
goose.
officially on the books.
The girl, with
Because being
little
married on paper and
understanding of
actually
the
living a
political
married life were two
calculus
very different
behind
things.
the arrangement,
And in the
is
world of
expected
medieval
to
aristocracy,
smile,
growing
nod
up was more of
politely,
a gentle
and
shove than a natural
eventually learn
progression.
her duties.
Let's imagine a young girl,
Meanwhile,
let's call
the
her Lady
adults
Marguerite,
around her
married at 12
discuss
to a boy
matters
named
of
Count Henri,
land,
who was
power,
perhaps 16.
and succession,
She
as though
didn't have much
nothing
choice in the matter,
unusual
of
is
course,
happening
though she
at
probably
all.
had learned by now that
It's
polite obedience was
simultaneously
the key to survival.
fascinating and
Her
quietly
days were not
tragic.
filled with games,
And,
as
of
we might hope
course,
for a
there were
12-year-old today.
cultural variations.
Instead, she spent
In
hours learning the
Italy,
rules of the
child
household, how to
marriages
set the
among the
table for
noble
dignitaries,
families
how to
often
address different
involved
types of
intense
nobles, which hand to
education,
shake and which foot to bow
including
with.
music,
Yes,
literature,
medieval etiquette
and
was surprisingly
religious
precise.
instruction,
She
preparing
also learned
girls
music,
for lives
embroidery,
as
basic
queens
math,
or
and
duchesses.
the Latin prayers that would help her
In
appear suitably
France,
pious.
girls sometimes
Because if a
married
young lady
royal
did not appear
cousins,
pious,
and
someone
the
was
courts
always
kept
nearby to quietly
meticulous
frown,
records
nod,
of
and make a
births,
note.
deaths, and
Count Henri,
marriages,
meanwhile, was
almost
being taught the
obsessively
useful parts
tracking
of manhood.
bloodlines to ensure
Swordplay,
nothing
horseback
embarrassing
riding,
happened
basic
in the
diplomacy,
gene pool.
and, most
And it
importantly,
did,
how
of
to
course,
think like a
because
landowner.
medieval
He had a
inbreeding
tutor,
was a
probably
long-running,
several, whose
somewhat
main job was to
horrifying
make sure
hobby
that he could
among
eventually
European
inherit titles,
elites.
manage estates,
But we'll
and,
get to
when
that
the time
later.
came, rule
For
effectively.
now, let's
If
gently
Marguerite and
observe
Henri
one
happened
more
to cross
example
paths,
from
they
the
would
distant
exchange polite
reaches
nods,
of Europe.
perhaps a small
In
conversation under the
Castile,
careful watch
a
of a
young
governess or
princess
steward.
was married at 11
Romantic
to a
feelings, if
prince
they existed,
slightly
were
older than
incidental.
her.
Now,
They grew
puberty
up
was
together,
approaching, which meant that
slowly
the actual
learning the
marital duties
strange
might come
rhythms
sooner rather
of
than
royal
later.
life.
A common
Lessons
misconception
in
is that these
governance,
children lived in
etiquette,
isolation until
and
they were fully
religious
grown.
piety
Not
filled
true.
their days.
Courtiers,
They were
tutors, and servants
expected
were
to
constantly
provide
around,
heirs,
keeping an eye on every
secure
minor detail,
alliances,
how she carried
and
herself,
maintain
whether he was learning enough
appearances,
Latin,
all
whether
while
anyone in the family had
negotiating
food
the
poisoning,
tiny
and
dramas
so on.
of adolescence.
Life was a
And,
quiet,
of
continuous
course,
stream
the
of
entire
observation.
arrangement was
Let's float
considered
over to France
utterly
in the
normal
14th century,
by
where
everyone
we see
involved.
some of the more dramatic examples.
So, as we float
Take
along
Blanche
this
of France,
quiet
married at
medieval
12 to
river,
Philip of
we
Valois.
can see a few things.
Their marriage was mostly
1.
uneventful in terms of
Childhood
romance.
in the royal
Philip was
and
older,
noble
somewhat
classes
distracted by
was
politics,
not really
and
a
Blanche was
time
learning
of
the subtle
play,
arts of courtly life.
exploration, or freedom.
She would spend long hours in her
2.
chambers,
Marriages
practicing
were
embroidery,
tools,
reading prayers, and
meticulously
occasionally
arranged
engaging
and
in
monitored
conversation
for
with her
political
husband.
benefit.
Philip,
3.
meanwhile,
The
was off
children
managing
themselves,
estates,
while
wading through the endless
surviving into
paperwork of kingship,
adulthood
and
in
trying
some
not to be
cases,
assassinated.
were often
Life
stressed overworked, and placed under enormous expectations long before they were ready.
And the political alliances of her family, depended on how well she performed her daily duties. Health was a constant concern. Child brides often faced early pregnancies, which were dangerous in any century but especially so when their bodies were not fully developed. Midwives were on hand, though their knowledge was, by modern standards, limited. A single pregnancy could be life-threatening, and yet it was expected. Royal families were surprisingly pragmatic, survival was uncertain, but heirs were essential. This created an atmosphere of quiet anxiety, like walking on a tightrope while trying to memorize a foreign language. And let's not forget the emotional side. These children, though young, were still human. They experienced fear, confusion, and the occasional moment of boredom or rebellion. Historical records occasionally hint at these private moments, letters complaining about tutors, secret hobbies, minor acts of defiance like sneaking extra food or hiding a favorite book. But for the most part, these children were carefully molded to meet the expectations of their families and society. In Italy, the story was slightly different but equally structured. Noble girls were sometimes married as young as 8 or 9, but the actual cohabitation with their husbands often waited until around 14. In the meantime, they were educated in courts that prized art, music, and poetry. Some girls, like the famous Isabella of Naples, became exceptionally cultured, reading classical texts and composing letters that are still preserved today. Their lives were still constrained, still pressured, but occasionally enriched by a level of education that many adult commoners would never experience. Meanwhile, boys in similar situations were often sent away for military training or administrative preparation. They might live in distant castles, learning from older knights or stewards. The marriage contract was still binding, but day-to-day life might be largely separate. This separation sometimes worked in the children's favor. It allowed them a few years of relative freedom before they had to face the responsibilities of married life. But it could also be isolating, leaving them emotionally unprepared for their eventual roles. Sometimes, the system failed spectacularly. Consider the English princesses married into foreign courts. Language barriers, cultural differences, and sheer distance often made early married life awkward and lonely. Letters would be sent back and forth, often carefully edited by advisors, expressing longing or dissatisfaction in ways that were socially acceptable. And occasionally, a young bride might attempt to escape or resist, though such attempts were rare and generally discouraged, or outright impossible. In Castile and Aragon, girls often married teenage boys from neighboring kingdoms to secure political alliances. These marriages sometimes required girls to move across mountains, rivers, and seas, adapting to new climates, languages, and customs. A 13-year-old might find herself suddenly living in a foreign castle, surrounded by strangers, expected to produce heirs and maintain decorum. It's quietly staggering to consider, but by the standards of the time, it was simply another part of life. And yet, amidst all this, there were small victories. Some child brides managed to carve out niches of power within their new households. They learned to influence decisions subtly, gain allies among servants and courtiers, and sometimes even shape political outcomes. These quiet achievements were rarely recorded in history, but they mattered. They allowed young girls to survive and sometimes thrive, despite the immense pressures placed upon them. Health, again, was precarious. Many young brides fell ill due to stress, poor nutrition, or the physical demands of early pregnancy. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Herbal remedies, prayers, and midwives were the main interventions. Families often watched silently, hoping the child would survive, because survival wasn't guaranteed. The faint hum of uncertainty underpinned much of these children's lives. Let's pause again to consider the boys. They had their own struggles, managing estates too early, learning warfare in the middle of adolescence, and trying to understand what it meant to be married to a girl barely older than a child. Some boys adapted well, others struggled with the pressure. A few became indifferent husbands, relying on tutors and stewards to manage both their spouses and their future domains. Again, history is mostly silent about the mundane, but this silence itself is telling. By the 15th century, the system was largely institutionalized. Contracts, dowries, ceremonies, and formal education ensured that child marriages were more organized, but no less demanding. Girls were expected to mature quickly, boys were expected to govern, and everyone else was expected to enforce the rules quietly and efficiently. The children themselves had little say, though they occasionally found small ways to assert themselves, hidden letters, secret hobbies, minor acts of disobedience. In summary, life for child brides and grooms was a gentle, continuous pressure cooker. Education, etiquette, religious instruction, and marital preparation consumed their days. Health risks were constant. Emotional lives were constrained. And yet, they persisted. They adapted, survived, and in some cases, thrived quietly behind the scenes, their stories preserved faintly in the dusty annals of history. So, as we continue floating through this quiet, dusty river, you can feel the rhythm of these lives. The steady, monotone hum of expectation, the soft weight of responsibility, the quiet anxiety and small triumphs. It's a world far removed from ours, but it existed nonetheless. And it's mesmerizing in its own subtle, hypnotic way, when young marriages went slightly sideways. Alright, let's continue our slow drift down the quiet river of medieval child marriages. Now that we've settled into the rhythm of daily life for these young royals, it's time to gently explore what happened when things didn't go exactly as planned. And, unsurprisingly, things often didn't. Because, let's face it, asking children to manage dynastic politics and produce heirs is a recipe for quietly interesting complications. Take Joan of Navarre, for example. She was married at 12 to Duke John IV of Brittany. John IV, an adult man with his own ambitions, quickly realized that Joan, though young, had an unexpected ability to navigate court politics. She observed, listened, and occasionally said something quietly strategic. Now, this might sound harmless, but in a court where every whisper could shift alliances, her early insights sometimes caused minor annoyances among advisors who expected her to be completely silent. It wasn't dramatic. No swords were drawn. But small letters were exchanged, subtle glances were noted, and a faint ripple of tension moved through the household. A quiet sort of chaos. And sometimes, the marriages produced, less than ideal heirs. In medieval Europe, dynasties were obsessed with producing sons, ideally multiple, so that the line could continue without interruption. But children, child brides, child grooms, were often biologically ill-prepared. Early pregnancies carried high risks of miscarriage, stillbirth, or maternal death. And when the children survived, they were sometimes frail or sickly, a reminder of the relentless pressure placed on their young bodies. This quietly affected succession plans. Kings and queens had to negotiate, adjust, and occasionally panic, not in the dramatic Hollywood sense, but in a slow, bureaucratic, mildly anxious way. Let's float over to England in the 13th century. Consider Eleanor of Castile, married at 12 to Edward I. Edward was slightly older, ambitious, and mildly intimidating. Eleanor, as a child bride, had to adapt to her new role quickly. The marriage eventually produced children, several boys who survived into adulthood, but not without strain. Eleanor's early pregnancies were dangerous, her health fragile, and her personal freedom limited. And yet, she managed, quietly influencing Edward's decisions and navigating the subtle intricacies of English court life. It's a testament to the resilience of some children when PLA. Not all marriages had such quietly successful outcomes. Some led to long-term friction, subtle political instability, or merely awkward social situations. Take Isabella of France, married at 12 to Edward II. Edward II was, not exactly a model king. He was known for his indecisiveness and a tendency to favor companions over his queen. Isabella, in her teenage years, had to negotiate not just a personal marriage but the complex political web of England and France. She eventually became politically active, leading to subtle but significant consequences for her husband's reign. In this case, early marriage meant early exposure to high-stakes politics, an exhausting experience for someone barely out of childhood. Sometimes, the young brides were relocated multiple times. In Spain, princesses were sent between courts for various reasons, to solidify alliances, to escape conflict, or simply because their parents thought it would be fun. A 13-year-old might find herself suddenly living in a foreign castle, learning a new language, and expected to maintain full composure. The monotony of daily etiquette lessons combined with the constant pressure of adaptation could quietly wear on even the most resilient child. Health crises quietly influenced dynasties. Early childbirth, poor nutrition, and infections were persistent risks. The mortality rates for young brides were higher than we often realize. Many did not survive past 20 or 25, leaving husbands to remarry and dynasties to scramble. These quiet tragedies were noted in court records with bland phrasing, almost as if to say, well, that was unfortunate, but life continues. And it did. Slowly, quietly, inexorably. Some dynastic disasters were almost comically bureaucratic. Take the Habsburgs, who famously intermarried to preserve property. Marriages between cousins and uncles and nieces created children with serious health issues, sometimes rendering them incapable of ruling effectively. The children were carefully educated, groomed for court, and sometimes married even younger than their parents had been. And yet, the pressure to continue alliances was stronger than the concern for their personal well-being. It was a quietly repetitive cycle of planning, birth, education, and observation, punctuated by faint sighs from distant historians. Occasionally, a child bride or groom would rebel, gently, quietly, in ways that didn't threaten life or limb but disrupted plans subtly. They might refuse a lesson, complain about food, or hide letters. These small acts of resistance were rarely recorded, but they mattered. They created tiny ripples in dynastic waters that could influence court decisions, inheritance, or even succession plans. History is mostly silent on these acts, but the gaps themselves tell us about the quiet agency these children exercised. Let's pause over Italy again. Some children married into courts where art, music, and literature were highly valued. Girls who were married at 11 or 12 might spend hours copying texts, learning to play instruments, or composing poetry. These activities weren't just for personal enjoyment, they were also tools of subtle influence. A well-educated young bride could write letters to distant relatives, advise her husband quietly, or even influence negotiations with other courts. It's fascinating to consider that some of the seemingly mundane skills taught to children were actually instruments of soft power. Meanwhile, boys in similar situations were often learning war, governance, and management. They practiced swordplay, learned languages, and memorized laws. Their interactions with their child brides were formal, polite, and highly observed. Any display of genuine affection was rare, and any hint of neglect could provoke minor political complications. The monotony of training, combined with the quiet tension of expectation, shaped their character slowly and predictably. Health crises continued to loom. For example, in France, child brides sometimes suffered from anemia, infections, or malnutrition due to court diets that prioritized presentation over nutrition. Early pregnancies increased vulnerability, and mortality rates were high enough that parents sometimes arranged multiple marriages for children in quick succession, just to ensure heirs. The quiet calculus of survival and reproduction dominated family planning in a way that was persistent, almost hypnotically repetitive, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of court life. And then there were the minor tragedies, misaligned alliances, unexpected deaths, or children who simply didn't thrive. These moments, though often minor in the grand scheme of dynasties, were emotionally significant. A child bride might lose a sibling, a mentor, or even a parent, all while managing the responsibilities of marriage. These cumulative pressures created quiet but lasting stress, shaping personalities and influencing decisions in ways we only partially glimpse in historical records. Let's float gently over to Castile, where young girls sometimes married foreign princes and moved across the sea. The transition was slow and quiet, learning new languages, understanding different customs, adapting to climate, and mastering household duties. The novelty of foreign courts could be interesting, but it also imposed emotional strain. Letters sent back home were often heavily mediated by advisors, reflecting political priorities rather than personal feelings. Yet, in the small gaps between formal obligations, some girls found moments of agency, a hidden letter, a private conversation, or a quiet hobby. These moments were small, almost imperceptible, but meaningful. In England, some child marriages led to surprisingly effective partnerships in later life. Edward III and Philippa of Hainaut married when she was around 12. She survived early pregnancies, adapted to the English court, and became politically influential, quietly shaping alliances and advising her husband. The story illustrates that while early marriage was risky and taxing, some children, through resilience, education, or circumstance, managed to navigate the system successfully. Yet, for every success, there were countless quieter failures, frail children, early deaths, mismatched alliances, or simply the persistent strain of growing up under observation. These were the subtle, almost invisible consequences of a system that demanded adulthood before it was biologically or emotionally reasonable. And perhaps this is the hypnotic quality of medieval child marriages, a slow, persistent tension, experienced in the quiet details of daily life, rather than in dramatic, explosive events.